surveillance authority associated with the hardware or with the phone instead of with the person or the terrorist. And we're going to ask Congress to help us with items like that. I'm grateful for the opportunity to go to the members of Congress, many of whom have called me and spoken to me during this last week and indicated that they are eager to provide a basis for us to address the new challenges which we indeed are facing as a result of this turning point in the history of the United States. And we will develop the tools, strengthen our capacity, and persist in our investigation and effort to disrupt and to make and reduce the risk of reoccurrence in matters like this. I thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today and for the reporting you do on this issue. Thank you.
All right, some strong words coming from the Attorney General this morning, calling terrorism the enemy of human civilization, saying that the United States will do everything in its power to disrupt these networks that he says are pervasive and substantial. He also went on to say that he would like to elevate the penalties for anybody accused of either harboring someone involved in a terrorist attack or the attackee itself to the level of espionage. Let's quickly go back to Bob Novak, who I'm sure would love to get back into the substance of his show. Sorry about the interruption, Bob. It was important to go to the Attorney General.
Thank you, Paula. We're talking to Richard Pearl, former Assistant Secretary of Defense. He is now a private citizen, but he is also chairman of the Defense Policy Board of the Pentagon, and so is a leading advisor to Secretary Rumsfeld, but he is speaking for himself in our conversation. Mr. Pearl, maybe you can help. You can clear up some confusion. We've been talking about war, that this is a war. We're talking about a military mobilization, and the Attorney General Ashcroft was talking about what seemed to be a criminal proceeding against individual terrorists. Is there a confusion there?
No, I think there are two tracks here. There's an effort to determine who individually was responsible for this act of terror and to try to discern the ties back to larger terrorist organizations. But separate and apart from that, if we are going to win the war against terrorism, we must take that war to the countries who harbor terrorists, who give them the facilities, the money, the training, the intelligence, the communications. Without that, the ability of these terrorists, bin Laden or anyone else, to inflict this kind of damage would be extremely limited.
Mr. Pearl, before we went to Attorney General Ashcroft, I understood you to be saying that we should take actions against terrorists or people who harbor terrorists, even if they are not necessarily associated with the catastrophe of September 11th. Is that correct?
Even if we cannot prove to the standards that we enjoy in our own civil society that they were involved. We do know, for example, that Saddam Hussein has ties to Osama bin Laden. That can be documented. So on the theory, which seems to me a valid one, that if you support terrorists and they then commit atrocities against Americans, you are responsible. Unless we hold those countries responsible, we will be chasing terrorists without significant effect.
If we go into, if the United States goes into Afghanistan, could you say perhaps that the United States has learned something from the Soviet catastrophe in Afghanistan, and that an expeditionary force is not the answer, that perhaps there has to be commando strikes, Delta Force teams, rather than putting in a big set-piece battle operation such as the United States had in Iraq?
Well, I have no knowledge of what may be underway in terms of planning, but I can't imagine that we would send a significant ground force into Afghanistan. We have a lot of other options. There's a civil war going on in Afghanistan. There is another side, not now in power, that deserves the support of the United States, and that may be a much better approach. There's something similar going on in Iraq, where there's an opposition to Saddam Hussein. They ought to have our support. We should be aligning ourselves with the opponents of terrorism where we can find them, and we should be taking this war to the heart of the enemy, which is the infrastructure that supports them. Without that infrastructure, There may be a car bomb, there may be a hijacking, but we won't see anything on the scale of the tragedy we've seen now.
Mr. Pearl, supporting the other side in Afghanistan or in Iraq may make for good long-run policy, but that's probably not going to do anything in the very, very short run. So I want to rephrase Bob's question. In the short run, if we determine that someone like Osama bin Laden is the culprit here, should we send in some kind of commando force to get him if need be?
Well, I don't know that we know where he is. We mustn't reduce the war on terror to a manhunt against Osama bin Laden. Despicable as he is, he's not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is a network of countries and terrorist organizations working together, hand in glove, supporting one another. And that provides the infrastructure that permits terror on this scale to take place. If the terrorists had to change location every night, if they couldn't walk into an office where they have communications and secretaries and research and the support of governments, their ability to do what has been done would be greatly reduced. So that's where we have to concentrate our efforts.
Can you do that without at least some commitment of American ground forces, wherever it be? For instance, the Weekly Standard this week raised the possibility of an actual war in the Middle East with United States ground troops there.
Well, we want to choose targets that are going to protect us, whose elimination would diminish the exposure of the United States to terrorist attacks. And I can't tell you that we have such a target in our sights today. I don't know. I have no inside information on this. But we want to choose targets very carefully. And when we have chosen them, we want to be devastatingly effective. We have the capacity to make the cost of supporting terrorism extremely high.
Do we have the intelligence capacity? Are you convinced that this was a breakdown of our intelligence capacity? And if you are, why should we have confidence in it in the future?
I think we have a lot of useful intelligence in terms of which countries support terrorist organizations. That's different from the kind of intelligence that permits you to foil a specific plot. There, I'm afraid, we're weak. But we do know which countries have been helping these terrorists. And they can't hide. They can't run. They have military installations, they have intelligence organizations, they have leadership facilities, and our ability to make the price very high for continued support of terrorism is substantial. And that could include, and in my view should include, the use of military force against the key installations of countries that support terrorism. And these countries, by and large, are dictatorships that depend for their own leadership on the ability to intimidate their own people. So if we strike at their intelligence organizations, at their military forces, we can be effective.
Mr. Pearl, you talked about the power of the United States military around the world, but as an advisor to the Pentagon, I'm sure you've been involved in what has been an effort in the Bush administration to revive the military from its weakened position over the last several years. Are you talking about a future strength, or do you believe that the United States military is capable of a major worldwide operation against these various targets?
I think we are very strong. We could be stronger. We need to make changes because our forces, even today, are a legacy in many ways of the Cold War, oriented toward Cold War missions, and we need to reorient them toward missions like this one, dealing with terrorism. But there's tremendous strength. We have the ability, for example, where we can identify targets, to destroy them from the air with very high probability of success.
I want to go back to Mr. Hunt's first question about the coalition building. You've been watching Moscow for about 30 years closely, I believe. And just over the weekend, we've had some statements by Ivanov, the defense minister, kind of backing away from support. And we've had support from Nikolai Patrushev, the head of what's the equivalent of the KGB, saying that he warned the United States about this, and we didn't take, the United States didn't take the advice. Based on that kind of comment coming from the Kremlin, how much help in this fight against terrorism do you expect to come from Moscow?
I don't think we'll get a lot of help from Moscow. I think the help will come from those Western democracies who share our values, who believe in the value of human life and individual liberty, who are part of our culture, our history, our tradition. The countries on the margins that we can drag into this kicking and screaming, who really don't want to be part of it, but we can intimidate, are not the kind of reliable allies that we need for this war.
Don't you have some concern, sir, about the United States, Israel, and Western Europe aligned against maybe 3 billion people around the world, Islam, China, Russia? The odds don't look very good there,
well,
do they?
I don't think we're against Russia or against China. And with respect to Islam, we're not against Islam. This country helped to save Bosnia. I wish we'd done more to save Bosnia and had done it earlier. What we are against are people who destroy innocent civilians in the name of some fanatical vision of what the world should be like. And for them, there is no room for America. There is no room for Western civilization and Western culture. They are the enemy, and it is in dealing with them that we must focus our efforts.
Is Iran one of the targets of our war on terrorism?
Iran has been supporting terrorism. There is
So they are
no doubt about it.
And the Saudis always say nice things, but is the past any guide to what kind of real cooperation they'll provide or not provide?
Well, I think the Saudis, unfortunately, have often looked the other way in order to try to diminish the terrorist threat to themselves. So I would not expect the Saudis to be the most reliable of our allies. The reliable allies are going to be those whose heart is in it, whose soul is in it. And that's the coalition we need to build.
The big question for Richard Pearl, and this Sunday morning, sir, there's a lot of talk in Washington that Reagan National Airport will never be reopened. If the United States cannot provide security for the close-in airport of its national capital, isn't that a great victory for terrorism?
It would be indeed. I can't believe that Reagan would remain closed. In any case, we mustn't fight the last war over again. The next attack will not be of the same nature as this one. It will be entirely different. If we close airports because of what happened a few days ago, we'll discover that that isn't effective because something else another route will be chosen.
What is the most dangerous route to think about now?
Well, I think we have to worry about the use of biological and chemical weapons against water supplies.
Okay. That's all the time we have of Richard Pearl. Thank you very much for joining us. From Washington, I'm Robert Novak.
And I'm Al Hunt. Now more of CNN's coverage of America's new war.
Thanks so much, gentlemen. Just a quick note before we move on here. As we take a look of the debris field, we have a lot of correspondents very close into ground zero. I wanted to share with you a fact that really is quite staggering. We have learned that 11.8 metric tons of gold, worth an estimated $110 million, and 30.2 million ounces of silver, valued at $121 million, is buried in the rubble below one of the collapsed buildings of the World Trade Center. And this belongs to people or firms that trade future contracts on the New York Mercantile Exchange. The market's, of course, opening tomorrow. The mayor reiterating he very much wants New Yorkers to get back to their normal lives. The mayor confirming that 80 people are dead, 115 of those identified, 5,097 registered as missing. He once again proclaimed that the city has emerged much stronger than it was just a week ago, and he very much wants New Yorkers to do what they can to get south of that area, south of 14th Street, that has been very difficult to get into. He wants people to go back to work not far from the debris of the World Trade Center. Right now we head to London, where Christiane Amanpour is standing by to tell us a little bit about an interview she did earlier today with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Hi, Christiane.
Paula, hi. As America has been mourning, so too there has been an enormous amount of support and shock and sympathy directed towards Americans from all around the world. And at the same time, we here at CNN have been speaking to the world leaders who would be part of a coalition that the United States is trying to forge right now. We've spoken variously to the president of France, to the leader of NATO, to the president of Turkey, to the president of Egypt, and also also today we talked to the Prime Minister of Britain, who again, in the most forceful language that he's used yet, has said that Britain will be together with the United States and that he was confident that the alliance would remain cohesive. Prime Minister Tony Blair was one of the first of the U.S. allies to come out and say categorically that the United Kingdom stands shoulder to shoulder with the United States. He also said that Britain's interests are intimately engaged because of the high number of British casualties. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for joining us this morning. Yesterday, the President of the United States said, "We are at war. War has been declared on us." Are you prepared to say that war has been declared and that there is a state of war?
Yes, whatever the technical or legal issues about a declaration of war, the fact is we are at war with terrorism. What happened on Tuesday was an attack not just upon the United States, but upon the civilized world. The thousands of people that lost their lives included nationals of many, many countries. Probably 200-300 people from Britain will have died in that terrorist attack. That makes it, in fact, the worst terrorist attack on British citizens that there has been since the Second World War. So this is a situation that concerns us all. Our own interests are intimately engaged, quite apart from the fact that in these times it's important that America realizes that her friends right around the world stand with her.
You and other leaders have talked about a global alliance to combat this global network of terror, and there are obviously many components, including a military component. What will the United Kingdom, what will Britain do if the United States decides to go to war?
This is something, obviously, we are discussing with the American president, the American administration at the moment, what help we can give. And I'm very pleased at the way that America and the American administration has gone out of its way to consult its allies, to keep us fully informed so that we are part of the deliberations they're making. But we have to do two things, in my view. First of all, there has to be a response to bring those terrorists who committed this attack to account, and we will play our full part in that. And secondly, there has then to be an agenda that we construct at an international level that involves the whole of the international community in dismantling the machinery of international terrorism, how it's financed, how these people move about the world, the countries that then harbour them and give them help. At every single level, we have to pursue and dismantle this machinery of terror. And that is important, not just for the purpose of bringing those people to account, but also in order to make sure that this does not happen again.
Britain has stood with the United States in most of its military campaigns of the last 10 years from the Gulf War on. Was it safe to say that if there is a military response, Britain will take part militarily? Well,
we've made it very clear that we stand side by side with the United States. And it's not a question of the United States simply saying, this is what we're going to do now, come and join us. The US is in close consultation with us and with other allies. And I think there will be a very broad support for a response that allows us to pursue and bring to account those responsible for this act and do it as an act of justice.
Do you think that the evidence is out yet? Have you been presented with what you need? You've talked about we need to know who did it, we need to see the evidence.
As President Bush said yesterday, it's fairly clear where the evidence is tending, but I think it is important that we consider the evidence in a very careful way, that it's factually based, that we are hard-headed about it. But once we have come to a conclusion, then it is important that we hold those people who are responsible for this, as I say, to account. And I think you will find, incidentally, that that is the view right round the world. I've spoken to Arab leaders in the past few days that have expressed their outrage at what has happened, their determination that this should be seen as something that the world of Islam is standing against, not merely countries like America and the United Kingdom. And I think you will find that there is enormous support for the idea that we must put together a broad-based coalition that hound these people down and that bring them to account and do it, as I say, for reasons of justice. We owe it to those people that lost their lives, to their families who are grieving, and to our own defence of democracy and liberty and freedom.
Which brings me to the question, you know, a lot of people are looking now at which country can be counted on, so-called, to stand with the United States and which country stand against. In the words of the US President, you're either with us or you're not. We have heard, you know, in the past, we've seen how in some attempts to build coalitions, there are some countries who don't particularly, you know, go rushing into this kind of thing. France sometimes has its own reservations, Germany has its own reservations. Do you think there will be a cohesive Gulf War-style alliance?
I do think that the whole of the civilized world will stand together, yes. And I spoke to President Chirac myself on the phone yesterday, and I can assure you I think that the whole of Europe will stand with America on this, because people know that what happened was not just aimed at America. It was aimed at all of us. I mean, these people believe they can achieve by mass terrorism what they cannot achieve by peaceful democratic means. And therefore, even though it is in our nature to be reasonable, to proceed very cautiously and carefully, we haven't sought this conflict. When the conflict comes, then as we've learnt before from our history, we have to be prepared to face up to it. And I think that for a long period of time, the world has turned a blind eye, been somewhat indifferent to the menace of international terrorism. And I think we're all, to an extent, culpable in that. But what we've got to do now is to realise that it exists, look at its full power and potency, realise that these people, incidentally, if they could do worse, would do worse. The number of people they kill is not limited by anything other than purely technical capability. There's no morality so far as they're concerned. And once we understand that, then I think it is important that we not merely, as I say, pursue those people who have been directly responsible and hold them to account, but then look at the way that terrorism operates, how it's financed, where it is, and how we pursue it and dismantle it.
Today there are reports, for instance, that even in England there's a bank, at least one bank, maybe more, that has been used to channel funds for propaganda for this group. There has been some radical voices in the Islamic community here calling for martyrdom and, standing against the United States in this matter. What does a democracy such as yours and other democracies, what can you do? Do you have to sort of encroach on perhaps some of the things that make a democratic world stand apart, some of the civil liberties, some of the protections on individual freedom of speech, freedom to act, freedom to hide under the banner of religious organizations? I mean, will you crack down here?
We will certainly look, as I think most countries will, at our own domestic laws and see how, in a sense, they measure up to the scale of the problem we now face. And I think we can proceed in a sensible way, which is to say people are perfectly entitled to express their views. And if people want to be anti-British or anti-American, we're Democrats. We believe that people have the right to express their views. But if they are engaged in organising terror or acts of terrorism, then we have got to act against that. And you're right, I think a lot of people will look at, for example, how terrorism is financed, how some of these people do shelter in our country, and not just our country, but other countries, democratic countries around the world. And if this evil of mass terrorism is as we say it is, then we have got to exercise the power and the vigilance to ensure that it's restrained and defeated. Now, I don't believe that that is to act in contradiction of our civil liberties. I believe it is in part pursuing the basic civil liberty that people have to go about their business free from terror.
Do you think there might be, I don't know, a system of identity cards or something similar to that?
Well, I think there are a whole series of things that people will look at in the wake of this. And I think this is the time, as it were, to set an objective and then to consider very carefully how we meet that objective.
Let's go back and talk about the alliance. How do you keep an alliance cohesive over what you've all described as a sustained, long and difficult campaign? It's going to take a long time, apparently, to do what you've described.
Well, of course, it's right in a sense that when we're merely offering words of support, that is, in a way, as I've been saying to people in the last few days, that's the easy part in one sense. I mean, the hard part starts when we actually take the action. But I think that support will be there, not just because of people's sense of horror and outrage at what has happened, but also because of their realisation that unless we take action, then we are all at risk. And so it is right for reasons of justice, but it's also right for reasons of self-protection. Now, I'm not saying there won't be difficulties along the way, there always are in these situations. But certainly so far as Britain is concerned, and I really do believe the vast bulk of the civilised world will stand with America.
Have you spoken to your Russian counterpart? Have you spoken to President Putin?
Yes, I have spoken to President
Putin. And what
Putin.
are they prepared to do?
Well, I think obviously you have to talk to President Putin about the specific things that the Russians will do to help in this situation, but I don't think you should be in any doubt that President Putin and the Russian people were utterly horrified by this. And of course, they themselves have suffered terrorist outrages in Russia too.
When we talk about the military component of any response, do you think NATO has obviously unprecedentedly given its full support to come to mutual defense of one of its members? Do you envision a classic NATO-style response, or how would you envision a military response?
I think there's a process that we need to get clear here. First of all, we identify those responsible. Then we work out the correct military response, and then we see the right way of putting that together. Now, I think we're too premature at this stage to start speculating on the exact nature of either the response or the way that we will pursue it. But obviously, as I say, there will be these two components to the action that we take. The more immediate action, if you like, to bring to account those responsible, and then over time, the systematic war upon the whole machinery of terrorism.
Do you think that the United States would take unilateral action, or do you expect that there will be, you know, further consultations and sort of gathering of the coalition?
I think that the way that President Bush has handled this is absolutely right. I mean, he has been very calm and measured in the way that he has approached it. He has been in close consultation with allies. Obviously, America has got to defend itself against such an attack. And, you know, we will be there in support of America in doing that, and that is important. But it has been done in a way that I think reflects very great credit in the administration, because their determination is absolute, but their way of doing it, quite rightly, is to say, look, this is where we stand, this is why we stand in this position, and join us in it. And I think that that will, of itself, win a great deal of support. And as I say, not just amongst Western countries or countries that are traditional allies of the United States. I think they will get support for that position right across the world.
The President of the United States has talked about a fight between good and evil, and a lot has been made of a sort of a clash of civilizations, or a clash of fanatics against the civilized world. How do you see this clash, if there is one?
Well, I think those are two very separate things. The vast majority of Muslims are decent, law-abiding people, were absolutely appalled by this outrage, and will be fully supportive of us taking action against international terrorism. Indeed, many Muslims are victims of international terrorism. So in no sense should this be seen as, if you like, one part of the world against the Islamic world. It's not like that at all, and I think people understand that very, very clearly. But it is a war, if you like, between the civilized world and fanaticism. And whatever banner that fanaticism marches under, it is important that we recognize these are people who will stop at nothing. And therefore, however difficult it is for us, and however much we will regret the fact that we have to take this action because of the terrible thing that has happened, nonetheless, we have to do so. And this is a time for, you know, for cool head, for calm nerves, and for an absolute and fixed determination to see this thing through. And we will see it through. It will be done.
On that note, thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Prime Minister. Now, not just the European allies, as you heard Prime Minister Blair, but also many of the United States Arab allies, and even countries in unsuspected quarters such as Iran, both hardliners and reformers condemning the attack. Basically, to sum up, it appears that there are some countries who would agree with military action with the United States, but in general, all the countries that have been asked have given political support. Paula?
Christiane, I was very much struck by one question you asked the Prime Minister, and your exact question was, will Britain take part militarily? And the Prime Minister didn't directly answer that question. His response was the U.S. Will have very broad support. I respect the fact that he doesn't want to telegraph what Britain's actions will be to the rest of the world, but what is your understanding of what British military involvement could be?
Well, he was very clear that he did not want to telegraph that, obviously, and you're right. But just based on previous actions, essentially the British have, certainly in the last 10 years, in every action that the United States has taken, from the Gulf War to the periodic attacks on Iraq to Bosnia, Kosovo, and the other actions, have stood side by side with the United States militarily. It is expected that Britain will take part in some form or fashion.
Well, you covered a lot of territory in the interview. Was there anything in particular that caused you to think in a different way about what the Prime Minister had told you?
Not really in a different way. I thought there were several interesting things that he flagged. One, this was the first time he said that it was a state of war. Two, he said that the coalition would stand firm and would work to maintain cohesion throughout what he called a long and prolonged campaign. And he did sort of seem to say that the evidence is still not yet in fully, but we'll wait and see just what exactly that means, Paula.
Christian, thank you so much for that strong interview. I have to quickly move to a special 3-hour edition of Late Edition with Wolf Blitzer. Among his guests this afternoon,